Welcome to the third dimension. Over the past years, Iran has increasingly resorted to irregular warfare as an important means of expanding its influence in the Middle East. Rather than conducting attacks against its adversaries, Iran operates indirectly through partners or proxies. As for Yemen, Tehran has provided different types of weapons and systems to the Houthis. Al-Quds Force and Lebanese Hezbollah have also provided training to Houthi militia to improve their military tactics and to help in the assembly, use, and maintenance of weapons and systems. To impact Iran's role in Yemen's war and the Iranian-Houthi partnership, join me from Ottawa in Canada, Professor Thomas Joono. Dr. Thomas is an Associate Professor of Public and International Affairs, Ottawa University. Welcome to the third dimension, Dr. Thomas.
Thanks for having me.
If I may start, Dr. Thomas, our conversation, in one of your articles about or debating this kind of partnership between Iran and the Houthis, you say, many see Houthis as Iranians' proxies, but this is only part of the story. What is your own assessment to the Iranian-Houthi partnership?
Overall, there's no doubt that Iran's support for the Houthis has significantly improved over the years. It started in the late 2000s on a fairly small scale. Ammunition, AK-47s, small arms, some intelligence, some advice on how to use that. But what we've seen over the years, and we can break that down in more detail over the conversation, is that support has increased after 2014 when the Houthis took over Sana'a, after 2015 when Saudi Arabia launched its own intervention in the country. Now what we see in 2023 is Iran providing the Houthis not only with more of the same, a lot of small arms, a lot of AK-47s, a lot of ammunition, a lot of advice, but also parts for missiles and drones in particular. Iran has also supported the Houthis in developing capacities to build mines inside the country. So now the Houthis have a number of military capabilities, missiles and drones in particular, that it would not have in the absence of Iranian support. The point that I was making in the article that you referred to is that I find that in a lot of Western commentary on the war in Yemen, there's a bit of an oversimplification where the Houthis are often described as basically not just proxies, but a pawn of Iran, as a puppet that Iran can manipulate to pursue its own ends in Yemen. So yes, Iran's support for the Houthis is significant. It has increased a lot over the years, but the Houthis are a strong, autonomous actor in many ways. The Houthis do not take orders. They do not take direction from Iran. They're a partner, but they're not a proxy or a puppet in that sense.
Okay. Now, of course, you followed with us 2 days back the United Nations panel of experts report, Professor Thomas, and there was a great deal of it, okay, accusations of Iran's smuggling arms to Houthis through what we call the Sea of Oman, okay? So, yeah, what is your take on this report? And I think following the story of the United Nations with Iran, allegations after allegations, etc., for me, this appeared the most detailed evidence the United Nations has done so far. How do you react?
So every year, around January or February, the UN panel of experts on Yemen, which is a group of independent, nonpartisan experts established as a result of prior UN Security Council resolutions, publishes an extremely detailed report. It's 200 to 300 pages in length. Every year, these reports have been extraordinarily valuable to researchers like me, to governments who want independent, unbiased information on what is going on in Yemen, generally speaking, and on the nature of Iranian support to the Houthis. So a lot of the publicly available information on this matter is really thanks to the very hard work of these panels of experts. The current report that you refer to, as well as previous ones in recent years, have provided extraordinarily detailed information on exactly how Iran provides all of these weapons to the Houthis, because Yemen is under an embargo by Saudi Arabia, by the coalition that Saudi Arabia leads. The US also leads a number of maritime interdiction operations to try to block Iranian provision of weapons and other types of support to the Houthis. So one of the really important questions is, well, how do these weapons come in? And typically there are a number of routes that Iran uses to smuggle these weapons. Some of them cross the Persian Gulf and go directly into Oman, and then they are smuggled by the land route through Oman and then through eastern Yemen and then up to northwestern Yemen, where the Houthis dominate. But also some of the other routes go through, as you said, the Sea of Oman, the Gulf of Aden, and then they get through Yemen through various means. Sometimes there's a transshipment that can occur at sea, where they will change boat to try to confuse the maritime interdiction missions by Saudi Arabia, by the US, by others. In other cases, there might even be transshipments through Somalia or other countries in the Horn of Africa. What is important here, and the UN panel of experts have done tremendous work to provide detail on this, is that Iran, for Yemen, but for that matter, to go to other countries too, like Syria, Lebanon, or the Palestinian territories, Iran has established over the years extremely sophisticated smuggling networks to be able to provide weapons, in some cases weapons parts, so parts of missiles, parts of drones, to the partners, the proxies, however you want to call them, that it supports. Every now and then we hear in the news that Western or countries or Saudi Arabia interdict some of these shipments. They capture them and then they report that to the media. Just about 2 weeks ago, the UK seized a ship, and there was a fair bit of information on the types of weapons that had been seized, small arms, ammunition, and so on. So these expert reports by the UN panels are extremely useful for our understanding in a detailed way of what is going on.
Okay. Now, if I just continue in the same context, Oman, Professor Thomas, now while we are carried away by news of Omani mediations, etc., okay, now this report signals what we call smuggling network through Oman, etc. So don't you think that Oman also plays some role here in terms of smuggling weapons to the Houthis? Because what we understand so far, that Oman is just doing the political kind of mediation.
So Oman's role is fascinating, and it is very complex. Oman, generally speaking, if we take a step back, has tried as hard as it can over the years to play a mediation role in various conflicts in the region. The nuclear deal between the US and Iran that came up in 2015 actually started as secret talks between the US and Iran 3 years before in Oman. We here in Canada had a hostage in Iran, an academic who was held in jail for 5 months in 2016, and it was as a result of Omani mediation that she was released from Iranian jail, where she was de facto a hostage. So Oman has really tried to position itself in the region as this kind of mediator in a number of conflicts, but very actively in Yemen. So Oman has not formally taken a side in the Yemeni dispute. It has, in the Yemeni war, it has refused to openly support the Saudi-led intervention, the Saudi-led coalition in Iran. It also refuses to formally support Iranian actions in Yemen, Iran's support for the Houthis in particular. What Oman tries to do is to have channels of communication with everybody. Oman literally talks to everybody. It talks to Iran, it talks to the Houthis, it talks to Saudi Arabia, and obviously it is very close to the US and to the UK. Sometimes that takes the form of actual cooperation. Oman works very closely with the US and the UK. In the case of the Houthis, Oman hosts a Houthi office. So the main Houthi negotiator is based in Muscat, the capital of Oman, and plays a very active role there. In terms of weapons smuggling, Oman's role is difficult to describe very precisely. Does Oman actively collaborate with Iran to smuggle Iranian weapons to the Houthis? I think the answer to that is no. I don't think there is active cooperation. However, does Oman sometimes close its eyes if it is aware of Iranian shipments of weapons crossing its territory to go to eastern Yemen and all the way to the Houthis, I think that's possible. There are a number of observers who accept that Oman closes its eyes. Why does it do that? Well, that allows it to keep track of these weapons shipments. It allows it to be aware of who the smugglers are, what are the routes that are being taken, and so on. It allows Oman to win a bit of political capital with Iran and the Houthis, which is a bit sensitive to say, but if Oman wants to play that mediation role, at some point it needs to have a minimum of political capital, of friendliness with Iran and the Houthis. Then closing its eyes in that sense does allow it to do that. The last point I'd mention here too, though, is that Oman is a very big country. Physically, it is large, difficult terrain, difficult geography, and Oman has a small population, small military, small border services, small police, and so on. So even if, which I don't think is the case, but even if Oman were actively trying to interdict every shipment of Iranian weapons through its territory, it probably wouldn't be able to do it, because the reality is that it is hard to do.
Yeah, but in the same point, Professor Thomas, if the assumption of Oman turning a blind eye in this case, okay, that also would collapse with the Omani image of being a mediator of peace, yes or no?
I don't think so, in the sense that being a mediator means that it's very difficult to be a mediator and to be successful as a mediator, to be clear. Yes. And that requires you to have a minimum, and a fairly high minimum, of confidence with all of the actors involved. So if Oman actively took a side in supporting Iran and the Houthis against the internationally recognized government of Yemen, then yes, that would become a problem. But for Oman to turn a bit of a blind eye, which is difficult, it's sensitive, but it allows it to have that level of relationship that is necessary with Iran and the Houthis to be able to play the role of mediator, that's probably frustrating for Saudi Arabia, for the internationally recognized government, but it's necessary. Keep in mind that if you look at things from the other side, Oman actually works closely with Saudi Arabia and the UAE on a number of files. Oman is a member of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, so it's not neutral on that side either. Oman is extremely close to the US and to the UK, the United Kingdom, so it's also not neutral at that level if you define neutrality in a very pure sense. So Oman plays a very difficult and sensitive game of balancing between all of these relations, which is necessary if we wanted to play that role of mediator.
Okay, of course, our focus is not Oman, but it came by the conversation as the conversation progressed. Now, okay, I will just bring you to another observer. He says, Tehran's military, technological, and advisory support for the Houthis is what allowed them to resist and eventually change the nature of the conflict. Do you agree with this?
I largely agree with that statement, in the sense that Iran's support for the Houthis has been significant. Let's keep in mind that a lot of the power that the Houthis have has been indigenous. It has been derived locally. So the Houthis absorbed significant units from the Yemeni military, including units that were previously loyal to former President Saleh. The Houthis have made pacts, alliances with a number of tribal militias from different parts of the country, but especially the northwest. That has also been very important for its power. So does all of the Houthis' military power come from Iran? No. But does a significant proportion of the Houthis' power come from Iran? Yes, absolutely. Not only in terms of quantity, small arms, ammunition, but also the more advanced kit that the Houthis have been able to use in more recent years. Let's use a very specific example to illustrate that. Yeah. About 2 years ago, UAE-backed militias from southwest Yemen started making important advances against the Houthis in the Ma'rib area in central Yemen. And these UAE-backed militias from the southwest were really threatening the Houthis' position in central Yemen.
True.
What did the Houthis do? They sent a couple missiles and drone attacks on the UAE, which did not do a lot of damage. But the message to the UAE was extremely clear. We can reach you. And if you continue advancing on us in central Yemen, in the Ma'rib area, we will reach you again, and the damage could be significant. Think about missile attacks on the very advanced and modern skyscraper buildings in Abu Dhabi or Dubai. That would be a disaster for the UAE. What did we immediately see? These UAE-backed militias moved away. They withdrew from the Ma'rib area, allowing the Houthis not to be threatened in the center. Without Iranian support, the Houthis would never have been able to do that. They would never have been able to reach or threaten to reach the UAE. So because of that Iranian support, the Houthis have really been able to push back against Saudi and UAE attacks and resist their pressure in a significant way.
Okay. So in fact, what you talk about is what we call the regional threat of this partnership between Houthis and Iran. Yes, Professor Thomas?
Absolutely. When the war started, if you go back a few years, the Houthis were a purely domestic actor. Yes, their rhetoric was threatening against the US and Israel, but they did not have the means to be a regional actor in the sense of a Middle East-wide or Gulf-wide or Arabian Peninsula-wide actor. Yes, they were able to do some cross-border attacks against Saudi Arabia, and that was a big problem for Saudi Arabia, but it was very localized. Today, the Houthis are a Middle East power. They are a regional actor in a way that was inconceivable just a few years ago. They can reach the UAE. They can reach almost all of Saudi Arabia. They can reach a lot of the Red Sea on the western side of the Arabian Peninsula. They can threaten maritime traffic in the Red Sea, in the Bab al-Mandab, which is the strategic choke point between the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea. Yeah. That is a major problem, not just for Saudi Arabia, but for the US too, and for the West, even for some countries in Asia too, for that matter. Today, the Houthis have a range with their missiles and drones that is somewhere a bit under 2,000 kilometers, so over 1,000 miles. That is not quite enough to reach Israel, which is about 2,000 kilometers away. But I would not be surprised if at some point in the next few years, the Houthis would have the capability to reach southern Israel, which would again add a major tool in Iran's portfolio of assets to pressure not just Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but also Israel.
Okay. Now, realizing this kind of threat on international waters, etc. Do you think, Professor Thomas, that what has been done so far on the part of international powers like the United States, the United Kingdom and France recently in terms of seizing these kinds of smuggled arms to the Houthis, do you think international powers are doing enough to curb Houthis' such acts?
That's a very difficult question to answer for a number of reasons, and I'll lay out very quickly these reasons. International powers, so as you said, chiefly the US, supported by the UK and France, and a number of countries, Canada has been involved too, my country, in some of these missions over the years, have been doing quite a lot at the maritime interdiction level, at the counter-proliferation level, to try to interdict, to block Iranian shipments of weapons to Yemen, but also to other countries in the region. Could more be done? In theory, yes, more can always be done, especially because we know that a lot of weapons are getting through, even though some are being blocked. But in practice, it's hard. Interdicting 100% of weapons being smuggled is extremely difficult. The US and its allies, the UK, France, NATO, Canada, have their hands full. Right now, Russia's war in Ukraine is the #1 short-term preoccupation, which means that a lot of military and defense resources are being shifted to Europe. In the longer term, there is a general recognition now that is very clear in Western countries that there needs to be a shift of military and security resources to Asia to contain and counter China. So the Middle East kind of has a bit of a challenge here in terms of priorities for the US and other Western countries, because it's not the short-term priority in Europe with Ukraine. It's not the long-term priority in the Indo-Pacific with China. So it's difficult to justify more resources going to, in this case, Yemen, but you can also make the case to Iraq or other conflicts in the region. So are Western countries doing enough? I think the answer to that is, in a way, yes, in a way, no. It's difficult to say precisely.
Okay. A final question, Professor Thomas, if you may. Okay. Now, looking at the political landscape and military landscape in Yemen and seeing all these things, what are the prospects of peace in your point of view?
The tragic reality, and it pains me to say that, but that I see the prospects for peace in Yemen as being extremely difficult, and unfortunately, but realistically, I'm not optimistic that peace will come to Yemen anytime soon. Yes, there's a lot of talk in the media these days of talks between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia. There's even reasons to believe that these talks may lead in the coming weeks or months, who knows, to some kind of arrangement between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia. In a way, that's good, but the reality is that I don't think that a Houthi-Saudi arrangement will be good for Yemen. If you define good for Yemen as stability, peace, and development for Yemenis, for the actual citizens of Yemen, I think what the Houthis in Saudi Arabia are trying to do with their current negotiations now is for Saudi Arabia to be able to withdraw as much as possible from the country. Saudi Arabia is exhausted from a war that has not been working well from its perspective, and the Houthis want to use these talks to consolidate their gains in northwestern Yemen. But Houthi administration in a good portion of Yemen that will come out of this will be brutal. It will not be democratic. It will be corrupt. It will be theocratic in many ways. And whatever the nature of this arrangement that comes out of this, the Southerners in the South, the Southern Transition Council, will not be happy. The internationally recognized government will not see itself believing in this deal. The UAE has not been very optimistic about where this could lead. Yeah. So all of this comes down to saying that if there is a Houthi-Saudi deal, it will not lead to peace in Yemen. It will not necessarily make things much better.
Okay. That brought us to the end of this interview. Professor Thomas, thank you so much for your time and your insights. And perhaps we can see you next time on Yemen Today TV.
Thanks a lot for having me. It was an honor.
Thank you. That's all for this time. See you next week with a new edition of The Third Dimension.